At 58, Josephine was tossed onto the cold pavement with nothing but two suitcases and the shattered remains of a 34-year marriage. Driven by absolute desperation, she spent her very last dollar on a condemned stone cottage. But what lay buried beneath its crumbling fireplace would rewrite history and exact the most devastating revenge. The rain in Boston that Tuesday felt less like weather and more like an eviction notice from the universe itself. Josephine stood on the curb outside the sprawling, gated Tudor estate she had spent 3 decades turning into a home, her knuckles white as she gripped the handles of her 2 scuffed suitcases. Through the wrought iron gates she could see the warm golden glow of the living room windows. Inside was her ex-husband, Gregory Hastings, pouring a glass of expensive scotch for Madison, a woman exactly half Josephine's age. At 58, Josephine was abruptly, terrifyingly obsolete. The divorce had been a slaughter. Gregory, a ruthlessly successful logistics CEO, had spent the last 5 years quietly moving assets into offshore trusts and restructuring his companies. When he finally dropped the papers on the kitchen island, he triggered an ironclad, heavily buried clause in a prenuptial agreement Josephine had naively signed at 22. Her lawyer, a public defender, outmatched by Gregory's corporate sharks, could do nothing. Josephine was walked away with a meager $4,000 in a checking account and a rusted 2008 Volvo sedan. She spent her first 3 nights in a roadside motel that smelled of stale smoke and damp carpets, staring at the ceiling and trying to remember how to breathe. The job market for a 58-year-old woman whose primary resume experience was homemaker and corporate hostess was a bleak, unforgiving landscape. She applied for retail jobs, administrative roles, even night shift stocking positions. The rejections were swift and humiliating. Her bank account bled hundreds of dollars a week just keeping a roof over her head and gas in her car. By the end of the month, she had less than $900 to her name. Panic, cold and sharp, became her constant companion. It was during a late-night session on a motel lobby computer that she saw the advertisement. It was an obscure, poorly formatted municipal website for the forgotten logging town of Old Creek, Maine. The headline read in block letters, "Revitalization Initiative, Historic Homes for $1." The catch was glaringly obvious. The buyer had to agree to reside in the property for a minimum of 5 years and bring the structure up to basic municipal code. Most of the homes listed were little more than rotting timber frames waiting to collapse, but Josephine had no options left. She was staring down the barrel of homelessness, and a collapsing roof was still a roof. She drove 12 hours straight into the teeth of the harsh New England autumn. Old Creek was a town time had not just forgotten, but actively abandoned. The main street was a graveyard of boarded-up storefronts and rusted mill equipment. She parked her sputtering Volvo in front of the municipal building and walked inside. The town clerk, an elderly man named Montgomery, who looked as weathered as the town itself, stared at her over his wire-rimmed glasses when she slapped a crisp $1 bill onto his desk. "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Hastings," Montgomery rasped, sliding a rusted, heavy iron key across the counter. "Property 44 on Briar Hill hasn't been inhabited since the Eisenhower administration. It's a stone cottage built into the side of the ridge. The road up there washes out every spring. There's no central heat, and the roof has more holes than shingles. You'll freeze to death before Christmas." "I'll take my chances," Josephine said, her voice shaking but surprisingly firm. She signed the thick stack of deed transfers, legally binding herself to the ruin. When she finally pulled up to Property 44, the sheer reality of her situation hit her with the force of a physical blow. The cottage sat at the end of a deeply rutted dirt path, swallowed almost entirely by dead, strangling ivy and thorny blackberry bushes. It was made of dark, heavy river stone, hunched under a sagging slate roof. The front door was severely warped, and 2 of the front windows were completely shattered, allowing the biting November wind to howl through the interior. Josephine forced the key into the rusted lock, kicking the bottom of the door until it groaned open. The inside was a nightmare of decay. The air was thick with the smell of rot, wet earth, and animal droppings. The wooden floorboards were warped and spongy, and a thick layer of grime coated every visible surface. In the center of this main room stood a massive, cavernous fieldstone fireplace, choked with decades of hardened soot and debris. Standing in the center of the freezing, filthy ruin, the weight of her 58 years crashed down upon her. Josephine dropped her suitcases, sank to the rotting floorboards, and wept. She cried for the life that had been stolen from her, for the youth she had given to a man who discarded her like trash, and for the terrifying, lonely reality of her future. She cried until her throat was raw and her lungs burned. But when the tears finally stopped, a strange burning sensation began to spread in her chest. It wasn't despair anymore. It was rage, pure, unadulterated fury. Gregory wanted her to disappear. He expected her to fade away into poverty, to be a quiet, tragic footnote in his life. She wiped her face with the back of her dirt-streaked hand. "Not today," she whispered to the empty, echoing room. Josephine walked back to her Volvo, pulled out a pair of heavy gardening gloves, a bucket, and a scrub brush she had bought at a dollar store on the way up. She had a house. It was $1, and it was a ruin, but it was hers, and she was going to survive. The first 3 weeks in the stone cottage tested the absolute limits of Josephine's endurance. The physical labor was brutal, stripping away the soft, manicured existence she had known, and replacing it with calloused hands, aching joints, and bruised knees. She lived out of one corner of the main room, sleeping on an inflatable mattress wrapped in 3 layers of thrift store sleeping bags to combat the dropping temperatures. Her days were consumed by survival. She patched the shattered windows with heavy-duty construction plastic and duct tape. She scrubbed decades of grime from the walls with bleach and freezing well water, dragging out heavy, rotten furniture left behind by the previous, long-forgotten owners. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but as the days turned into weeks, something miraculous began to happen. The cottage started to smell like pine soap instead of decay. The structural bones of the stone walls proved incredibly sturdy, and Josephine, for the first time in her life, felt a fierce, independent pride blooming in her chest. However, as November bled into December, the true enemy arrived, the bitter Maine winter. The temperature plummeted into the single digits. The space heater she had hooked up to the cottage's single working outlet was virtually useless against the biting cold radiating from the stone walls. Her breath plumed in white clouds, even inside the house. If she was going to survive the winter, she needed a real fire. She needed the massive fieldstone fireplace dominating the center of the room. The fireplace was a hulking, imposing structure big enough for a grown adult to stand inside, but it was entirely blocked. Decades of bird nests, fallen mortar, and petrified ash had turned the hearth into a solid wall of debris. On a freezing Tuesday morning, armed with a heavy steel crowbar and a rusted snow shovel she had found in the collapsed shed outside, Josephine set to work. She chipped away at the hardened layers of soot, choking on the black dust that clouded the freezing air. It was backbreaking work. She struck the hardened ash, shoveled it into heavy garbage bags, and dragged them out into the snow. By late afternoon, she had finally cleared the main firebox. Exhausted, she collapsed onto her knees, wiping a smear of black soot across her forehead. She leaned forward to inspect the floor of the hearth to ensure it was safe to build a fire. That was when she noticed it. The entire floor of the cottage was made of thick, uneven oak planks, but the hearth itself was paved with massive, flat river stones, except for one. Directly in the center, buried under years of packed ash, was a perfectly square, precision-cut slab of dark slate. It didn't match the surrounding stonework at all. Frowning, Josephine ran her gloved hand over the edge of the slate. The mortar around it wasn't solid. It was deeply cracked, and as she pressed her fingers against the seam, she felt a distinct freezing draft blowing upward. Her heart gave a strange little skip, a draft from beneath a solid stone hearth. Curiosity overtaking her exhaustion, she wedged the flat edge of her heavy crowbar into the deepest crack along the side of the square slab. She leaned her entire body weight onto the steel bar. At first, nothing happened. The stone was impossibly heavy. She repositioned the crowbar, gritted her teeth, and pushed with every ounce of strength her aching arms could muster. With a loud grinding screech of stone against stone, the slab shifted an inch. Josephine gasped, scrambling forward. She jammed the crowbar deeper into the newly created gap and pried again. The heavy slate tilted upward. She dropped the crowbar, wedged her thick gloves under the lip of the stone, and hauled it back. The slab flipped over with a heavy thud, sending a cloud of ancient dust billowing into the air. Josephine waved the dust away, coughing, and looked down. She expected to see dirt, or perhaps the remnants of an old ash pit. Instead, she was staring into a perfectly dry, brick-lined hollow, about 3 ft deep and 2 ft wide. It was essentially a hidden vault. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembling, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her small LED flashlight, clicking it on and shining the beam down into the dark cavity. Resting at the bottom of the hollow was a heavy, rusted iron lockbox. It was roughly the size of a large suitcase, reinforced with thick steel bands and covered in a thick layer of gray dust. "What in the world?" Josephine whispered, her voice echoing in the dead quiet of the cottage. She lowered herself onto her stomach, reaching down into the hole. Her fingers brushed the cold, rusted metal of the box's handle. She gripped it and pulled. It was staggeringly heavy. It felt as though it was filled with lead. Grunting with exertion, she braced her boots against the edge of the hearth and hauled the box upward. It scraped against the brick walls of the hollow before finally cresting the edge. Josephine dragged it out onto the wooden floorboards, her chest heaving. The box had 2 heavy clasps on the front, but the central padlock had rusted through completely. Josephine sat back on her heels, staring at the iron chest. For a moment she was terrified to open it. What if it was something horrible? What if she was violating a grave or unearthing something better left buried? But the sheer driving curiosity of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose propelled her forward. She reached out and snapped the brittle padlock. It crumbled into flakes of orange rust. She flipped the heavy metal latches, dug her fingers under the lid, and pushed it open. The hinges screamed in protest as the lid fell back. Josephine stared inside the beam of her flashlight, illuminating the contents. She stopped breathing. The silence in the cottage was suddenly deafening. The box was lined with dry, yellowed oilcloth. Lying on top of the cloth was a thick, leather-bound ledger, its cover cracked with age. But it was what lay beneath the ledger that made her head spin. Stacked in immaculate, gleaming rows were dozens of heavy, rectangular ingots. Even in the dim light, there was no mistaking the dull, mesmerizing luster of solid gold. Each bar was stamped with a faded insignia and a weight, pure, untraceable Depression-era bullion. To the left of the gold, wrapped tightly in wax paper and bound with brittle twine, were thick stacks of large-sized vintage currency, $100 gold certificates from the 1920s, their ink still vibrant. Josephine's mind short-circuited. She was looking at a fortune, millions of dollars sitting quietly beneath the floor of a dollar house. Her trembling hand reached out and touched one of the gold bars. It was freezing cold and impossibly heavy. It was real. It was actually real. Overwhelmed, she slowly pulled her hand back and picked up the leather-bound ledger resting on top of the treasure. The leather was dry and brittle, flaking onto her jeans. She gently opened the cover. On the first page, written in elegant looping fountain pen ink, was a date, October 14th, 1952. Beneath the date was a handwritten inscription. Josephine brought the flashlight closer, squinting to read the faded script. As her eyes scanned the words, the blood in her veins turned to ice. To whoever finds this, know that this wealth was taken from those who did not deserve it to secure a legacy for my bloodline. Hide it well. Trust no one. Elias Hastings. Josephine dropped the book. It hit the floorboards with a heavy slap. She stared at the signature, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Hastings. Elias Hastings. Gregory's grandfather. The man Gregory's family never spoke of, the disgraced patriarch who was rumored to have embezzled millions from an industrial conglomerate before vanishing without a trace, leaving his family to slowly rebuild their reputation from scratch. Gregory had spent years and thousands of dollars in private investigators trying to locate his grandfather's legendary lost assets. convinced they were hidden in a Swiss bank or a Caribbean trust. Instead, Elias had driven into the middle of nowhere, buried his stolen empire under the hearth of a stone cottage, and died before he could tell his heirs where it was. And now, through a twisted, miraculous stroke of legal irony, Josephine owned the cottage. She owned the land, and according to the state of Maine's abandoned property laws, she had meticulously researched before buying the home. She legally owned everything inside it. Gregory Hastings, the man who had thrown her onto the street with nothing, had inadvertently funded her acquisition of his own family's lost empire. A slow, sharp smile spread across Josephine's soot-stained face. The bitter cold of the room vanished, replaced by the blazing, fiery warmth of perfect, impending vengeance. The discovery of Elias Hastings's stolen empire beneath the freezing floorboards did not send Josephine into a blind, reckless frenzy. Instead, the gold instilled a quiet, calculating ice in her veins. She knew the moment she tried to liquidate, the massive hoard alarms would sound. The IRS, the state authorities, and worst of all, Gregory, would descend upon her like vultures. She needed impenetrable legal armor before she ever spent a single dime. For the next 3 days, she lived entirely on adrenaline and canned beans. She meticulously photographed every single ingot, every vintage banknote, and every page of Elias's ledger using her outdated smartphone. Then she wrapped the heavy gold back into the oilcloth, lowered the iron chest into the hearth's hollow, and dragged a massive rotting oak credenza over the loose slate stone to hide it completely. With 5 of the 1920s gold certificates hidden securely inside her bra, Josephine drove the sputtering Volvo all the way to Manhattan. She avoided the flashy, highly publicized auction houses. Instead, she walked into the discreet, heavily guarded offices of Stack's Bowers Galleries, a real world-renowned numismatic and antiquities dealer. The appraiser, a meticulous man named Harrison, examined the pristine bills through a jeweler's loupe. His hands actually trembled because the bills were uncirculated and historically flawless. He purchased them directly for a staggering $85,000 in a private, untraceable cashier's check. Josephine didn't buy a hot meal or a new winter coat with the money. She walked directly into the towering glass skyscraper housing Baker McKenzie, one of the most ruthless and prestigious corporate law firms on the planet. She bypassed the junior associates and slapped her cashier's check onto the polished mahogany desk of a senior litigation partner, a shark-eyed woman named Evelyn Hayes. "I have a property dispute," Josephine told Hayes, her voice devoid of any emotion. "And I need you to build a fortress around my assets." Over the next 2 months, Hayes and her team of legal gladiators went to work. They quietly funneled the rest of the antique currency through private Swiss auctions, using the massive influx of clean capital to establish an unbreakable web of blind trusts and LLCs in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. They legally re-registered the Old Earth Creek property under a heavily shielded corporate entity. The gold bullion was slowly and systematically transported via armored Brinks trucks to a secure private depository in Zurich. Josephine remained in the freezing cottage, continuing to chop wood and patch the roof, living the facade of a destitute, struggling woman. She needed Gregory to believe she was still drowning. She needed him complacent. The trap was finally set in early April. Josephine directed her legal team to anonymously leak a single redacted page of Elias Hastings' ledger to a prominent financial journalist at the Wall Street Journal. The leaked page detailed the exact routing numbers Elias had used to embezzle funds from his original logistics empire, the very same company Gregory now controlled as CEO. The article hit the morning editions like a bomb. It exposed the fact that Gregory's entire corporate empire was built on stolen, untaxed Depression-era funds. The company's stock plummeted 15% in a single morning. Gregory, predictable in his absolute arrogance and panic, immediately hired a massive team of private investigators to find the source of the leak, and more importantly, the missing ledger. It only took them 3 weeks to trace the anonymous tip back to a shell company, and eventually to the municipal property records of Olders Creek, Maine. When Gregory's sleek black Mercedes Maybach rolled up the deeply rutted muddy driveway of Property 44 on Briar Hill, Josephine was waiting on the porch. She was wearing heavy Carhartt overalls, holding a steaming mug of black tea, and smiling. Gregory stepped out of the luxury vehicle, his perfectly tailored Italian suit completely out of place against the backdrop of the decaying Maine woods. He looked furious, his face flushed red with indignation. Beside him was his high-priced corporate bulldog attorney, a man who looked distinctly uncomfortable in the mud. "You vindictive, pathetic woman," Gregory spat, marching up the wooden steps. "Did you really think you could extort me? Did you honestly believe you could find my grandfather's ledger, leak it to the press, and I wouldn't crush you into dust?" Josephine took a slow sip of her tea. "Hello, Gregory. I see you got my invitation." "I'm taking everything," Gregory snarled, stepping into her personal space. "My grandfather's ledger belongs to the Hastings estate. Whatever you found in this rotting hovel belongs to me. I'm having you arrested for grand larceny and possession of stolen property." Josephine didn't flinch. She simply reached into the deep pocket of her overalls and pulled out a crisp, heavy legal document, handing it to Gregory's lawyer. "You should read that before your client continues to embarrass himself," she said smoothly. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, scanning the document. All the color rapidly drained from his face. "Mr. Hastings, this is a problem." "What is it?" Gregory demanded, snatching the paper from his attorney's trembling hands. "It is a legally binding declaration of abandonment," Josephine explained, stepping down from the porch. "When Elias Hastings buried that box, he explicitly abandoned it. And when I purchased this property, the municipal contract stated that all abandoned, unrecorded assets within the property lines transferred to the new deed holder. Furthermore, under the state of Maine's strict treasure trove laws, the contents belong entirely to the finder. I am the legal finder." Gregory let out a sharp, dismissive bark of laughter. "You think a small-town municipal code overrides my family's direct inheritance rights? I will tie you up in federal litigation for the next decade. I will drain every cent you have until you are begging me for a settlement." "You could," Josephine nodded in agreement. "But you won't. Because of the prenuptial agreement." Gregory froze. The air around them seemed to suddenly drop 10 degrees. "What are you talking about? The prenuptial agreement you forced me to sign 34 years ago," Josephine said, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. "The one you used to throw me onto the street with $4,000. Your lawyers drafted it to be completely brutally airtight, didn't they? To ensure I could never touch a single dime of the Hastings family wealth." She pulled a second document from her pocket, a highlighted copy of the very contract that had ruined her life. Section 4, paragraph 12. Josephine recited from memory, her eyes locked onto Gregory's. "Neither party shall have any claim, right, or entitlement to any assets, properties, or wealth acquired by the other party independently after the dissolution of the marriage, regardless of the origin of said assets. You made sure I couldn't touch your money, but in doing so, you legally severed your right to touch mine." Gregory's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stared at the highlighted text, his mind frantically trying to find a loophole that his own expensive lawyers had deliberately closed. "But wait, it gets better," Josephine continued, her smile widening into something truly terrifying. "Because you see, Gregory, the ledger wasn't just a map to the gold. It was a detailed confession." She motioned toward the black Maybach. "Your grandfather documented every single illegal transfer. He explicitly stated that the initial capital used to found Hastings Logistics was completely stolen from federal grants. The gold under my floorboards is clean, untraceable bullion, but your company, your entire corporate structure, is built on a heavily documented massive federal fraud. And because you just admitted on the record in front of your own lawyer that the ledger belongs to the Hastings estate." Josephine leaned in close, lowering her voice to a whisper. "You just claimed inherited liability for 80 years of federal tax evasion and corporate embezzlement." The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the wind rustling through the dead ivy. Gregory looked at his lawyer. The lawyer slowly took a step away from Gregory, the realization of the massive federal crime implication settling over him. "The department clears throat of justice, and the IRS have already received unredacted copies of the ledger from my attorneys at Baker McKenzie," Josephine said, turning back toward the door of her stone cottage. They are executing warrants at your corporate headquarters right now. You're going to lose the company, Gregory. You are going to lose the houses, the cars, the offshore accounts, and Madison. You're going to lose everything. Gregory dropped the papers into the mud. He looked like a man who had just been shot in the stomach. He staggered backward, leaning heavily against the side of his luxury car, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "You have a nice drive back to Boston, Gregory," Josephine called out without looking back. "Drive carefully. I hear the repo men are fast these days." She stepped inside the cottage and closed the heavy wooden door, locking it behind her. Over the next 2 years, the downfall of Gregory Hastings was a spectacular, highly publicized corporate slaughter. The IRS seized almost all of his assets to pay off decades of compounded penalties. Hastings Logistics was dismantled and sold off in pieces. Gregory managed to avoid federal prison by liquidating his remaining personal wealth, but he was left a broken, disgraced man living in a small rented apartment in the suburbs. Madison left him before the ink on the federal indictments was even dry. Josephine, however, didn't leave Olders Creek. She loved the quiet town. Using the massive wealth she had legally secured in Zurich, she poured millions into the local economy. She hired local contractors to completely restore the stone cottage, expanding it into a breathtaking, eco-friendly modern mansion that honored the original stonework. The massive fieldstone fireplace remained the centerpiece of her sprawling, sunlit living room. She funded the revitalization of Main Street, opening a bakery, an antique shop, and a small community library. The locals revered her. To them she was a mysterious benefactor who had brought their dying town back to life. Only Montgomery, the old town clerk, ever suspected the truth, though he wisely kept his mouth shut whenever he saw Josephine drive past in her sleek, restored vintage Volvo. On her 60th birthday, Josephine sat in a plush leather armchair in front of a roaring, crackling fire in the very hearth that had changed her destiny. The house was warm, safe, and entirely hers. She held a glass of expensive red wine, the firelight dancing off the crystal. She looked down at the solid slate stone, set perfectly into the floor of the hearth. The hollow beneath it was empty now, but the power it had given her radiated through every inch of her new life. They had tried to throw her away, to bury her in the cold and the dark, but they had forgotten one crucial, undeniable fact about women like Josephine. When you bury them, they become the foundation. Josephine's incredible journey proves that sometimes our darkest moments lead us to unimaginable hidden treasures. If her brilliant revenge and stunning triumph inspired you, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder to never give up, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable real-life tales of revenge and victory. What would you do with the gold? Comment below.